Well, my name is Emma Howes. I am currently living in the state of South Carolina. I'm an assistant professor of English at Coastal Carolina University in Conway. I received my PhD in 2014 from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in English with a specialization in composition and rhetoric, which is essentially the study of writing, the study of how we use language in groups, how we use language within particular communities, and to perform particular purposes. Well, when I was in my undergraduate degree, I was trying to decide between sociology and English, and I had an afternoon where I was working on a project for an English class. I was analyzing a poem, and I just loved it. I had a moment, I was sitting at the table and I was working through and reading this language and thinking about the ways that it made me feel and the ways that the writer was able to express these ideas through these images, and I thought, this is what I want to do. This is it. This is where I'm happy. And that's when I decided to study English. Later on, I started to learn about the connections between language and identity, language and the ways that we think, the ways that we're able to express ourselves, the ways that we see the world. And I thought, wow, this is really, really amazing. And so at that point, my studies in English actually started to combine some of what I had learned in sociology and became a little bit more sociological in nature, a little bit less about literature, less about sort of symbolism and metaphor and things like that, and a little bit more about how language actually circulates in the world, who gets access to what kinds of language instruction, and the ways that schools are all interconnected, right, with these larger social systems, which I find really, really fascinating. I'm teaching English there and working with the translation and philology department and with their students. And I am also having the opportunity to do a little bit of work with teacher training, bringing some of the pedagogical practices that I've been working with in the States, and sharing some of that information and learning from teachers here in Kazakhstan and Almaty and Uсть-Kamenogorsk as well, which has been a really, really wonderful opportunity just to get to know alternative ways of approaching language instruction. We are not as bilingual in America. We're very monolingual, at least in the areas that I live. Different regions are a little bit different. And so it's been really, really interesting to learn from and have conversations with people here in terms of language instruction and different ways to approach it. I think there are some differences that I've experienced. I think the structure of the American Academy is a little bit different. My instruction in the US tends to be a little bit more student-centered, to try to encourage them to be a little bit more interactive. And I think that's something that's in transition, from what I understand, that I think Kazakhstan is becoming much more student-centered in its instruction. So I think that's just kind of part of the process. But in many ways, they're similar. I think there's a lot of commonalities. I think I see some of the sort of globalization of culture. You know, I have students in the US with cell phones. I have students in Almaty with cell phones. And so there are more similarities than I think I expected. I think some of the polychronic time and the ways that American students understand time and the ways that my Kazakh students think about time is maybe a little bit different, but I'm still sort of working through what that means. Today's workshop was the final workshop of a series of 3. And for this workshop, I was focusing on some of the ways that we can teach academic writing that really try to build a sense of ethos, a sense of authority, a sense of sort of self or confidence in the ways that students in particular, but really any of us as writers, create text. And so Monday we started with the sort of metaphor of what we see, the metaphor of sight, starting with the immediate, what is around us, and how we can use our everyday as a basis to create inquiry, to create questions, to create research. Yesterday we talked a little bit about listening to text, the metaphor of listening, so moving kind of through the senses, moving through the body, and how when we pause with a text, with a source, with a piece of writing, we can allow it to sort of speak past what it may seem like it's about on the surface and really dig deeper into what the writer is trying to communicate. And then today's workshop was about speech. It was about finding that sense of voice. Kenneth Burke uses the metaphor of the parlor when he talks about writing, the idea that anytime we write, we're walking into sort of almost a cocktail party, you know. The conversation is already happening. It's our job as the writer to figure out what that conversation is and then find our voice to add to it, to speak to it. And so today's activities were based around moving into that speech part, moving into finding voice in different ways to respond to a text. The direction that my studies have taken me over the past few years have been in the direction of contemplative pedagogy and contemplative practices. So one of the things that I really try to encourage in my students, we live in a very fast-paced world, and particularly in the West, particularly in the US, we're constantly bombarded with images and advertisements and tasks, and I really encourage my students to slow down, to be mindful, to move, to read, to write with intention and with care. And I think that when we actually interact with the text, instead of read it as quickly as we can because we have to read it, and then write as quickly as we can about the text because it's due tomorrow and we just have to get things turned in and things like that, if you're able to sit with a text, if you're able to really think about ideas, if you're able to write and then to revise, to re-see, to rethink, I believe that we're often able to create more thoughtful responses, more thoughtful ways of being in the world. And I think there's tremendous value to that. And I think that sometimes it's hard to have that permission to take a deep breath and to look at where you are and to appreciate your surroundings and to really enjoy reading and writing. It's difficult to do at school, but I think that that's if you can master that, you know, you're doing great.